Having bank accounts set up is naturally an important part of most businesses. We'll take a look at how we make deposits when we discuss customer transactions in a later chapter. But one other task we need to know how to do is how to write checks against the account. Now I know some of you may not have a problem at all writing checks, but this is actually using the software, not just going out and shopping. Again, we'll talk about paying specific vendors who have bills in a later chapter as well, but sometimes we just need to write a check for something that doesn't use a bill and that was purchased using a handwritten check. What I know first of all, though, by looking at my chart of accounts, is that my business savings account simply falls before my business checking account because of the way they're created. What that means is if I open up the checkbook, it's going to default to the business savings account. And I don't usually write checks on the business savings account, so I would actually like to modify that. There are preferences for the checking that you can use. So I'm going to move up to the upper left, click on the Edit menu, come down to Preferences, and when that dialog box opens, I will see that I can actually work with the checking account, the third category actually from the top. These are my preferences, so I will select the default account that I want to use, and notice you can actually have several. One to open when you write checks, one when you open to pay bills, to pay sales tax, and to make deposits. All you have to do is put a check mark next to any one of these that you want, and I want all four, and then to go ahead and select the appropriate account. You'll see both of them show up. Now, why would you need to have all four? Well, like I said earlier, you may have separate accounts that you use for paying sales tax or making deposits and other types of things. So this simply gives you the flexibility of choosing a different account for several of the different types of transactions you work with. Once this is set, you can go ahead and say OK. And now we're ready to start writing checks. Well, if I wanted to write a check, I might think that I should go up to the banking menu. That sounds like a reasonable place, and you know what? It is. The keyboard shortcut is Control W. W for write is the way I think of it. So I'll click OK, and you'll be happy to see this opens up just a check that looks like a regular check that you would write. So it's fairly intuitive to know how to use. What I'm going to do is actually create a check for a debit card transaction that I made. I just ran down to the office supply store and I bought some paper and some toner, and I used a debit card. Now, it's not a credit card, it's a debit card, so the monies are taken from the business checking account. That's where I need to create my transaction. So I'll just start by looking down and seeing what we need to know. We'll notice that it starts off with business savings. I'm going to go ahead and change that. This should be the last time that I have to do that, and change it to business checking. It shows me the current balance in my account, and now I can begin to add some of the other information. You can add the date, or it will pull up the last date that you wrote a check, so sometimes I need to change that. And then I need to add a vendor. Now, I haven't actually added any vendors yet, so what I'm going to do is type in the name of a company, Office Supplies R Us. And as soon as I press Tab or try to move off of that, QuickBooks is going to remind me that they aren't currently a vendor. It also gives us a couple of options. You can go to Quick Add, which basically just says, let me take the name and find out what kind of customer or vendor it is, or you can go through the full setup. We're going to set up actual vendors in a different lesson, so for now, I'll click Quick Add. It needs to know whether they're a vendor, a customer, an employee, or other. They are a vendor, so I say OK. And that's all I have to do to start creating the check. Now, normally you might want to fill in the information about how much the check was for. But I prefer to always go down to the bottom of the check, because here we have two tabs, one for expenses and another one for items that we hold in inventory if we're purchasing them. I'm going to stay on the Expenses tab, and I'm going to click under the account, and this is where I choose the account to which I want to charge the expense. Since I bought paper, that would be for office supplies, so I will select that account. Put in the amount. I bought some paper, so about $12.48. I'll press Tab to move next to the memo, and I like to keep very detailed records, so I'm going to put in what kind of paper this was. 2 reams of bright white. You'll notice that there is space to attribute this expense to a customer and a job. That way it could be a billable expense. If I wanted to do that, I would keep track of it for that purpose. This is just for general office use, so I don't need to. What I want to do now, though, is I want to go ahead and add a second item that I purchased. It's also an office supply, so I'll choose that account again. This was a little bit more expensive. It was $78.20. And it was for black toner for the printer. Now what you'll notice as I'm adding all of these up is that our check on the top is actually getting filled out. I don't have to do the math. I don't have to type in the amount on the top and then come down and put in the individual payment items. That's why I like to use the Expenses tab. It kind of keeps a running total. Now, if for some reason you don't want what you've already done, you can click the Clear Splits button to clear all of that out, or you can also click Recalculate if you've changed something and for some reason the check hasn't totaled up correctly. The one last thing I like to do, just like I do when I write a regular paper check, is to put in a memo. Something simple since the details are already on the Expenses tab. Something like that. Now, next to our expenses and our items, you will also see a couple of check boxes. If you have online payments set up, you can go ahead and give that a check. That means the next time you go on to your bank, it will transfer this and it will actually make that an online payment for you, instead of having already written the check. I've already paid it, so I don't need to do that. Likewise, I do not need to print this check. I already used my debit card. Notice that when I remove this check mark, then I get a number at the top. When it's checked, it just says number of the check is to print, and it's going to use whatever the next sequential number is when I do a batch run. I'm going to remove that, and it is not check 1. I could either leave it blank, or I could have some kind of code that I use. I'm going to put DC for debit card. At that point, I'm all finished. I can come down to the bottom right, and I can either do Save and Close or Save and New. I'll click Save and Close. And if we actually went into our business checking account, I'll just double click on it. We can see that that check shows up. So I could have entered the check using the register. Sometimes I prefer to write it like a check. It's just easier and kind of more intuitive because we're used to seeing it that way. But all the information is here: the date, the type of transaction, who it was paid to, the total amount. You'll notice that it says split instead of showing a single account because we had office supplies in 2 different lines. And then, of course, the memo that I put in shows up in the memo line. This is all good news. It means my writing of checks has been accurately entered into QuickBooks.